Hey, how are folks doing today? Happy Thanksgiving. Lovely day, isn't it? Lovely time. Pandemic 2020. I hope that some of you were able to have a lovely meal today. And if you were not able to have a lovely meal, if you were forced to spend the holiday in isolation, my heart goes out to you. I am deeply sorry that that happened, and I hope that I can give you a bit of company and a bit of solace. But this is going to be remembered, as many people have said, as the worst Thanksgiving ever for many people. I mean, for me, not necessarily. We found a nice Italian restaurant here in the neighborhood. My wife and I were able to go there. It was a bit expensive, but we sat in the outdoors. They have not yet closed the restaurants here in New York City. So we were able to have a nice meal at an Italian restaurant. So we did celebrate Thanksgiving to some degree or other. But yeah, I know a lot of people, just stayed home. Just stayed home. Maybe they cooked a turkey on their own, or maybe they just ordered out. Or hey, you know, there you go. I'm glad to be with you on the evening of Thanksgiving, and I've got an interesting conversation to have with you tonight. My opening remarks, we're going to get into some interesting questions because I tweeted recently about the way socialists and scientific Marxists understand the concept of revolution, and it got quite a response, and so I'm going to make sure I get all of your chat messages. Very good. Um, so I decided that tonight I would actually use my opening presentation to just talk about, the question of could there ever be a revolution in the United States? Could it happen? Could it possibly happen that the United States would have a socialist revolution? I think so, but I don't think that would necessarily happen the way a lot of people seem to think it would happen. And that's what I'm going to talk tonight about in my opening presentation. But before we go there, if you're just joining us, welcome. Be sure to hit the like button. Be sure to hit the subscribe button. Be sure to hit the notifications bell. Be sure to share this on Reddit, Facebook, Twitter, etc. Make this a bigger conversation. The more people who watch this, the more fun we're going to have. And keep the super chats rolling in. I'll write them down as they roll on in, and then I will answer them all after our roll call. So that's the idea. So if you've got a question or you've got something you want me to talk about, shoot me a quick super chat. I will write it down, and I will answer it during the second half of our evening show tonight. So be sure to hit the like button if you haven't done so. Be sure to hit the subscribe button. And I think I'm going to start by telling you a joke. So the joke goes like this. There was a church in a very small town, and the minister of this church was known for giving very, very boring sermons. Just very, very boring sermons. And his audience almost seemed to fall asleep whenever he was giving his sermons. And he felt bad about this. He would look out at the congregation and they would just be sleeping. They were so bored with his sermons. So the minister had an idea. He decided that he was going to open his sermon, thank you for the super chat, in a very dramatic way. He was going to open his sermon, his next sermon, by getting out in front of the church and saying, "Wow, I have just received word that everyone who's part of this church community, everyone in this town, everyone in this county is going to die." And of course, that would startle everyone and get their attention. And of course, he would then proceed to say, of course, everyone's going to die, but are you going to go to heaven when you die? And from there, he would just give his standard speech, his standard sermon. But the idea was he would capture everyone's attention by coming out with a panicked look on his face and saying, "I've just received word that everyone who's part of this church community, everyone who's part of this town, everyone in this county is going to die." And he would say it so dramatically that it would get everyone's attention, and no one could accuse him of giving a boring sermon. So, the next Sunday came. The minister walked out to give his sermon, had a panicked look on his face, and said to the audience, he said, "I've just received word that everyone in this town, everyone who's part of this church community, everyone in this county is going to die." And a man a few rows from the front started laughing. He was taken aback. The minister said, "Sir, I don't know if you heard me correctly. I just said that everyone who's part of this church community, everyone in this town, everyone in this county is going to die." And the man just laughed even louder. He said, Sir, can you tell me what in the world is funny about that?" And he said, "I'm not from around here." Yes. He's not from around here. Anyway, I've always kind of appreciated that joke. Some people find that joke to be hilarious, and other people just go, "What? He's not from around there? I don't get it," right? You have to kind of understand the humor there. I'm not going to explain it if you don't get it. Think about it. If you don't get it, you're not going to get it. If you do get it, you appreciate it. I think it's very funny. It's a very funny joke. But there's a lot of little, jokes like that kind of, point to kind of the quaint cultural behaviors of Americans, right? That we have a certain way of behaving with each other. Alec de Tocqueville, he wrote Democracy in America. And, he said that there could never be a revolution in the United States because every time there's an election and there are two parties, so instead of having a revolution, we just vote in the other side. If people are angry, there's unrest stewing from below, why we never have a revolution, we just vote for the other side. And in normal times, in times in which there is no economic crisis, there is no major dramatic struggle in the ruling class, that is pretty much true, right? But you have to understand that all times are not normal times. Furthermore, Mark Twain. I don't know if folks know Mark Twain, the famous American writer. He wrote Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn. He was known for little kind of jokes about the American public and about the American mindset. And he said very famously that the United States is a country where we're free. Or how did he put it? He said, the United States is a great country because we're free to think whatever we want and say whatever we want, but we have the common decency to do neither. And I think that's a good assessment, right? There is kind of a calmness or an ultra politeness about our population, right? Now New York City is New York City, and there are certainly different behaviors in different ethnic communities and stuff. But all right, becoming a journalist, all right, But overall, when you talk about U.S. culture, U.S. society, there is this kind of politeness. That goes with it, right? And that kind of accompanies Alec de Tocqueville's assessment of the fact that we could never have a revolution because we'll just all go vote and we'll just do the right thing and we'll vote for the other party, so there won't be a revolution. That all kind of fits, right? And that if you live in the United States in times when there's not a big economic crisis, not a big political crisis, you would think, Americans were just so polite, we're just we so much believe in voting. We so have this complacency, this competency that we would never would there be a situation in which the government would be replaced with a new form of government, in which one social system would be replaced by another social system. It would never happen. And I've heard that my whole life, right? People would always say to me, well, revolution in the United States will never happen. There will never be socialism in the United States. There will never be any kind of revolution in the United States. The United States government is so powerful. U.S. society is so prosperous and so stable. Things will never change. The social, political, and economic order of the United States will never change. I've heard that my whole life. What's interesting is I don't hear that so much anymore. With what's happened around Trump, with what's happened around COVID, the Black Lives Matter protests, the rebellions, I certainly I certainly don't hear that any longer. And in fact, many people were saying that Donald Trump was planning to become basically communist or an authoritarian fascist dictator. I heard that the right wing is saying that Antifa and socialism is on the brink, and now the notion that revolution could happen in the United States is much more widespread among the population. It's some kind of dramatic event that would change the political and economic system of the United States, a new government coming into power, bloodiest labor wars. Now these conceptions, are pretty widespread among the population. Honestly, though, I don't think we're going to have a socialist revolution anytime soon. And again, I think that what that actually means, and what a lot of people think it means, is not the same thing. But that said, let's talk about, so communist, leftist groups in the United States, in order to justify their existence, they have to give an explanation of how we could get from point A to point B, how we get from where we are now to socialism, right? I mean, if there is no possible way the United States could ever have socialism, then there's no reason to have a communist party or a socialist party or a revolutionary organization in the United States. So every communist group in the United States, to some degree or other, has to give its members some kind of hypothetical narrative about how what they are doing is getting them to socialism, right? And I'll tell you, I have studied the American left. I was a member of a communist group for 8 years. I was very close to another communist group for a few years before that, and I have studied, and I have been around the left, and I'll tell you, the narratives you get from most existing left parties about how the United States will get to socialism are malarkey. They're bull honking. And I'm going to refute a few of the narratives now. I'm going to tell you what do communists in the United States think could lead to a socialist revolution, and none of these things are correct. The first conception I want to talk about, I actually heard in detail at a workshop. I remember in 2007, I went to the first U.S. Social Forum. There was a workshop put on by a certain socialist group in the United States. It was about building the progressive majority, building Bill of Rights socialism in the United States. And I sat through their speech, and this is how they explained revolution was going to happen. They argued that they said that the main thing is you have to defeat the right wing. They said the Republicans are fascists. They are the main danger. There's no hope for social progress until the Republicans are just absolutely defeated, until there is such a solid majority for the Democratic Party in both houses of Congress that no Republican could ever get elected. Once a progressive majority is established, they said, then they said the Democratic Party will split between the pro-monopoly Democrats and the labor Democrats. The labor Democrats will be tied to the labor unions. The pro-monopoly Democrats will be tied to liberal, capitalists. And the Democratic Party will split between the pro-labor Democrats and the pro-monopoly Democrats. Then the pro-labor Democrats will start enacting progressive reforms. First, they'll have free health care. Then they'll, create guaranteed college. And then they'll nationalize this industry. And then they'll nationalize that industry. And gradually, the labor wing of the Democrat will, one step at a time, build socialism. And they won't call it socialism, they said. They will not call it socialism. And in fact, we won't even realize it while it's happening. It'll just kind of be a gradual process that goes on. And 100 years from now, people will look back and they'll say, wow, between, this time and this time, the United States basically became socialist. Nobody realized it. They called it something else. And that's how it would happen. And I sat there in this workshop and I thought, that is complete and utter malarkey. And why is it complete and utter malarkey? Because when society enters a crisis, not only does the left get stronger, but the right also gets stronger. Right? And that revolution comes from a crisis. It doesn't come from a gradual transformation, one step at a time. That's not how these things happen. They just don't happen that way. And that the Republican Party, in a two-party system, the one party doesn't go away, right? And it just doesn't happen. So I was sitting there and I thought, this is a bunch of malarkey. Furthermore, you don't build socialism one step at a time, right? That's not how these things happen. I mean, the state must change hands ultimately. And if the state does not change hands, you're not going to move towards socialism. And if the state does change hands, it's not going to be one step at a time. It'll be rather dramatic and quick. So that conception, building a progressive majority on the road to socialism, defeat the right wing, that really is, it's an older idea. The guy who originated that idea was Edward Bernstein. And Edward Bernstein was the father of the term revisionism, right? And Edward Bernstein basically said, the movement is everything, the goal is nothing, right? And that socialism is nothing but the sum of reforms, that progressive reforms of capitalism just kind of naturally all add up into socialism. And Edward Bernstein and this group that was putting out that whole thing, that progressive majority, building socialism one step at a time, what they were putting out there was basically arguing that there is no event horizon. There's no clear line between capitalism and socialism. Capitalism just kind of naturally turns into socialism a little bit more every year, and this is just the march of human history. This is just historical inevitability, and it just kind of happens that way. And that was the belief of social democracy, largely. That was the belief of the Second International. That was the belief of all kinds of reformist elements. And it's false. It's wrong. It has never happened, right? The British Labour Party has been trying to put this strategy into practice for the past 100 years, and it hasn't worked out too well, right? The French Socialist Party, the Social Democratic Party of Germany. If the Western countries were just going to kind of naturally, one step at a time, transform into socialism, it would have happened by now. And in fact, we saw some very, very dramatic events to the contrary during the 1930s, right? We saw the rise of fascism. The 20th century pretty clearly shows that this idea that there's just going to be a gradual, one step at a time transformation into socialism is absolutely wrong. So that's the first misconception. This evolutionary socialism, Bernsteinism, it's wrong. And I sat there in the workshop, and to be fair, right, this was back in 2007, and I know for a fact that there are a lot of people in the organization that put out that narrative now who absolutely disagree with that, and that no longer represents what that organization stands for. But that's back in 2007, right before Obama got elected. That's what that organization was putting out, and it's wrong. And those ideas are still quite widespread. I mean, maybe not among that particular group, but there's many leftist groups in the United States that kind of think that if we just eliminate the right wing, eliminate the Republicans, gradually out of Democrats having a 100% secure victory, socialism will kind of come and the Democrats will split. A lot of the people in the Bernie Sanders movement think things like that. Well, they're wrong. I mean, that's just not how history advances, right? The right wing gets stronger as the left wing gets stronger. So, in a time of crisis, both the left and the right get strong. Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump are both signs of our age. You don't have a Bernie Sanders without a Trump. You don't have a Trump without a Bernie Sanders, right? That it's not, history doesn't just move in one direction. As society enters a crisis, there is a polarization on both sides with extremes on both sides, right? Hitler was a response to the rise of the German Communist Party, right? The attempted fascist dictator of Russia, who attempted to crush the Bolshevik Revolution, Kornilov, he was a response to the power of the Bolsheviks. And I'm getting ahead of myself. I'll be getting to that later. But that history does not march in just a straight, clear line like this, right? That there are contradictions and clashes. And when those contradictions and clashes become very serious, that's when you have a revolution. They don't happen as things just kind of naturally progress in one way. So that conception that I just told you about is wrong. Now, conception number 2, which is also wrong, was put out by another organization on the left. Not going to name them because they may not think us, and they might even, this is a group that tends to get all nitpicky, and so they'll insist that I misrepresented it. But based on reading their material, I've come to the conclusion that this particular organization, their belief was that they said that only what they call the lumpen proletariat were revolutionary. And by lumpen proletariat, they meant low-income African Americans. And they said that a revolution would basically consist of events like the Los Angeles Rebellion or riots of 1993, happening in a number of major cities all at one time, and that within these urban rebellions among low-income African Americans, There would be a communist group that would be, while not everyone rebelling would be part of it, they would be kind of the motor behind the rebellion. They would be the main organizers. And this communist group that would be at the center of these urban black rebellions, they would eventually, in the course of these urban black rebellions, breaking out in a number of states, start taking control of whole areas within these cities. Sections of the police and military would come over to their side, and they would start declaring liberated territory in these cities, hypothetically speaking. Sections of the military would come over to their side, and then, of course, the U.S. federal government would have to come in, but many within the U.S. Army would be demoralized and supporting these black urban rebellions, and would refuse to fight, and basically there would be some kind of brief civil war, in which, in response to a bunch of urban black rebellions, this communist group was brought to power. Well, that's ridiculous. That is absolutely ridiculous. That is absolutely ridiculous, because if you look at it, right, while, yes, there are widespread anti-capitalist sentiments among urban African Americans, and have been for a long time, and there's a particular anger at the state among urban African Americans, the United States is a very, very, very big country, right? And, there are a lot of white people in the United States. There are a lot of Chicano people in the United States. There are a lot of people of many different nationalities, number one. So if you're going to make a revolution to overthrow the government on the basis of one nationality, that's not going to happen. Number two, right? Who's to say that this group would ever develop that level of influence, that much influence in urban black communities, that they would be at the center of some kind of urban rebellion? I see urban rebellions happening right now, right? There was the George Floyd uprising. And while this group attends and sells its newspaper, I don't see them at the center of it. In fact, I don't see members of the urban black community rallying behind this organization. There's black nationalism, which is a much bigger trend among the black community than this particular communist tendency. In fact, most of the members of this group are white. So, the idea that the black community would rise up in rebellion against police brutality and racism with this communist group at the center of them, and this would lead to a situation where the military and the police would be divided, that's ridiculous. That would absolutely never happen, right? And, I also think that kind of scenario is a bit of a nightmare for most working people in the United States, most especially the people living in urban black communities. The idea that their neighborhood or their city would become the battlefield of some kind of hypothetical American Civil War is not a very appealing idea, right? It's not something, if someone came into my neighborhood and said, the goal of my organization is to transform this organization into the battlefield of an upcoming armed confrontation with the U.S. government, I would say, good sir, I don't quite want that. I would like to go to work. I would like to, eat. I would like to have my kids go to a decent school. I don't want my neighborhood to be the battleground, ground zero for some kind of hypothetical armed civil war, right? So even if this were possible, it's probably not something most working people would find to be desirable, right? Going around and saying that your goal is to basically make the urban black communities of the United States ground zero for some kind of armed revolution is not a very good, appealing message, number one. And it's also not going to happen. And the idea that the black community is going to put its support behind a group of white communists, I might add, is pretty ridiculous. So this second scenario put forward by a certain organization, that's completely ridiculous. And I'm not naming them because I'm sure they would deny this is what they want and get very, very upset. They don't like it when you talk this way. This People's War, urban rebellion, lumpen revolution thing that's not realistic, number one, not desirable, not going to happen. So we've been through the progressive majority idea, the progressive majority defeat the ultra-right on the road to socialism, evolutionary socialism narrative. That ain't going to happen. We've been through the, black community rising up and waging armed civil war against the government scenario. That ain't going to happen. Well, what else? What else do we got? Well, I mean, this one among people in the United States who call themselves communists is not, it's not particularly popular among actual communist activists, though I will say it's popular among the right wing, number one, and it's actually been the subject of a Hollywood movie. And furthermore, this narrative is also, apparently, this is what some of the weathermen and the weather underground talked about. It's what some of the third worldist Maoists talk about. And it's even more unplausible. And this is the third scenario that you hear from American leftists about how the United States will go to socialism. Red Dawn. You ever see the movie Red Dawn with Patrick Swayze? Right? The movie begins. All right, BSL. The movie begins with, you know, a group of kids are in class and their teacher is giving them a lecture on Genghis Khan, and all of a sudden they look out the window and there are paratroopers landing, you know, communist paratroopers landing, and they go into the classroom and shoot up the teacher, and pretty soon there are Russians and Nicaraguans and Cubans taking over their neighborhood, and mwahaha, you evil Americans, you must pay for your crimes against the international working class. This is the stupidest narrative I've ever heard, right? It's in a Hollywood movie, right? The movie Red Dawn was made to help sell Ronald Reagan's Contra War. Right? That's basically what it was about, right? Is that Ronald Reagan was trying to convince the American public that the USA had to send guns and weapons and stuff to the drug-dealing terrorist Contras of Nicaragua, had to do it because, look, I mean, if they take Nicaragua, next they'll take Mexico, and next they'll be invading and shooting up your social studies class in high school. It was a stupid right-wing movie in the 1980s. They remade it during the Obama years to be about North Korea. It's a dumb, idiotic right-wing movie. Sadly, though, apparently the Weather Underground believed something like this was the only real hope for revolution. The Weathermen, right? Bill Ayers, Bernardine Dorn, Mark Rudd, you know, they were trying to lead like urban hippies to like fight the American government in the 1960s. You know, they had, you know, Days of Rage and stuff that didn't work out too well. So then they went underground and started doing like symbolic bombings, and they basically were arguing that that basically one day the Soviet and Chinese tanks were going to roll in over the U.S. border, and when that happened, they would put Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dorn in charge, and they'd be ahead of the new puppet government of the United States. And I think they said something like a certain section of the population would be put in concentration camps because they were, you know, they were in prison camps or something because they were reactionaries who were pro-imperialist or something. This is the nutty third worldist fantasy, right? The elements that say that the American working class is inherently reactionary, right, and has no revolutionary potential. All the American white workers are all a bunch of racists and sexist and homophobic, pro-imperialist scum, labor aristocrats, settlers. You've heard this, right? This is big on the internet among synthetic left elements on the internet. That element that think that the American, you know, the American working class are all, you know, reactionary scum. The only hypothetical way they can see socialism happening is some kind of foreign communist invasion. One day the enemy marches in and forces the United States to become socialist at the point of a gun, and that is also ridiculous. Folks, the United States has the largest military budget in the world. Folks, let me repeat this. The United States has the largest military budget in the world. Are you telling me that any government in the world, Russia, China, Venezuela, Cuba, North Korea, would be stupid enough to invade the United States? This is the dumbest idea I have ever heard. I'm sorry. I mean, you're telling me that you believe that one day it'll just kind of magically happen and there'll be a bunch of Chinese, you know, paratroopers outside your high school social studies class? This is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Right? And also, let me add, I don't know of any socialist country that would ever want that. Right? Why in the world would it be something that the socialists of the developing world or around the world would want? Why in the world would they want to invade the United States? What would they gain from that? What would they gain from invading the United States? Nothing. Right? This is a right-wing fantasy. It is a 1950s McCarthyite fantasy. And the left is so isolated and confused that there are leftists who buy, the right wing is telling us horror stories about Red Dawn, and then there's leftists who think it's a good idea. They're like, yeah, that could happen. Oh God, yes, that's the state of affairs, right? That's, the third worldist elements and something that would never happen, but the right wing of the United States trying to stir us up and get us to hate communists, someday the Soviets are going to invade America and they're going to force you at the point of a gun to be communist. And the left in the United States is so isolated and confused. They're like, maybe that would work. That's a good idea. Give me a break. Okay, so I have listed 3 scenarios that are commonly given in leftist circles for how to get to socialism. None of them are correct. But I am going to tell you tonight how the United States could get to socialism. And here's the first thing I'm going to say. And this is a very tough pill for a lot of people to swallow. A very, 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 very tough pill to swallow. And again, it's one of these situations where there is nuance involved. There is nuance to what I'm saying. So listen very, very carefully. Communists in the United States do not and should not advocate a violent revolution. Let me say this one time again. Communists in the United States do not and should not advocate a violent revolution. Now, this is something that gets people angry. They say, oh, no, I read State and Revolution by Lenin. I'll get to all of that. But if you are somebody in the United States who is an advocate of socialism, you should never advocate a violent revolution. Ever. Why? Because violent revolutions are awful events in which lots of people die. Violent revolutions are disastrous occurrences that are completely undesirable. Right? It's one thing to be a teenager and fantasize about, you're going to be a hero or something, but the reality is anyone who has ever lived through a violent revolution where there's a civil war and one faction in the civil war replaces the existing state with their existing state apparatus, that is a horrendous event in which lots of people get killed and there's a lot of bloodshed. Lots of lives are destroyed. Lots of people not only die, lots of people lose arms and they lose legs. Lots of people go without food for a long time. Lots of people go without electricity for a long time. Lots of people, witness horrendous events that give them PTSD for the rest of their lives. Okay? Violent Civil War-like revolutions are something that no sensible person wants. No sensible, rational person wants there to be violent civil war, destruction, and revolution in their country. Furthermore, I would say there are a lot of working class people that aren't even really very excited about, the Black Lives Matter protests. They might agree with the cause, but they're a little bit nervous about the violence associated with those protests, about the instability associated with those protests. The lives of working class people are very unstable. It's unstable because they might not be able to pay their bills. It's unstable because, people in their family and their community might go to jail. It's unstable because there's police brutality and the working class people's lives are very unstable. Working class people want stability, not instability. They want peace and more peace in their lives, not more violence and killing. And the fetishization of violence, the obsession and the desire for violence is a middle-class deviation. Marxists, serious Marxists, read the writings of Lenin, read the writings of of Marx and Engels, read the writings of Mao, they've always denounced what they call punchism, or Blanquism, or left adventurism. Right? These currents that fantasize about some kind of big catastrophic civil war. This is like nails on a chalkboard to the overwhelming majority of people living in the United States. When people in the United States hear that, when people who just want to live their lives and live a decent life in the United States hear that, they go, "Get away from me." They have no desire to see that happen to their country. So if you are a communist or a socialist, the last thing that you should ever do is advocate violent revolution. What your job is to not look like a crazy person, not look like a fanatic, not look like a violent terrorist. Your job is to put on a suit and tie and to coherently explain a revolutionary program and put forward steps through which the United States could transition to socialism. Your job is to look like the most responsible, upstanding, community-loving person who's got some good ideas of policies that would put forth the question of property relations and transform the United States to socialism. The job of revolutionaries in the United States is to put forth a revolutionary program and make it clear and have a mass understanding of that revolutionary program, to build organizations centered around that revolutionary program, and to build a community and an apparatus of people dedicated to the revolutionary program and to organizing in communities and educating in communities and providing services to people and building the apparatus that could ultimately lay the basis for the big struggles that could lead to actually enacting this revolutionary program. That is the job of a revolutionary. The job of a revolutionary is to present the revolutionary program and to build the revolutionary organization. That is the job of the revolutionary. The revolutionary must present the revolutionary program and build the revolutionary organization. Now, the question is asked, well, Caleb, you're telling me we shouldn't advocate a violent revolution. You're telling me that we shouldn't put forward a revolutionary, call for the violent overthrow of the state. You're telling me we shouldn't do those things, but didn't they have a violent revolution in Russia? Didn't they have a violent revolution in China? Haven't there been many countries, Caleb, that had a violent revolution? So you're telling me that communists don't believe that, but I'm opening a history book, Caleb, and I see communists doing that, engaging in violent revolutions. And you're telling me that communists don't believe in violent revolutions. So what in the world are you talking about? Well, let's go through that on a case-by-case basis. How did the Russian Revolution happen? Well, the Russian Revolution, you have to go back to you have to really, I'll very quickly tell you how the Russian Revolution happened. I could do hours on this, but basically, there was a Marxist movement in Russia. There was something called the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, the RSDLP, the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. And they organized labor unions among Russia's factory workers, and they led strikes and protests, and they built labor unions. There was factories in Russia's urban areas. There were protests and strikes and labor unions. Well, there was this guy named Lenin, and he had the idea that instead of simply having an organization that led labor unions and strikes, they should build what he called a party of new type. And this party of a new type wouldn't just go and attend protests and strikes that happened, but it would be a highly disciplined organization that would go to all the struggles existing among the people and try to transform them into a revolution and try and encourage these struggles and protests to lead to eventually creating socialism in Russia. So he formed the party of a new type. Now, there was a very famous incident that started, and it was in 1905. In 1905, Russia was in an economic crisis. Russia and Japan were at war with each other. A lot of people in Russia were very, very hungry. And so the Russian secret police, the government, basically, a guy who was a member of the secret police, an informer, named Father Gapon, a priest, was hired to lead fake protests against, basically not even protests, but fake marches among hungry, unemployed Russian workers. So Father Gapon, in 1905, he led a bunch of Russian workers to go to the Tsar's palace to march and ask the Tsar to feed the hungry people. And he was an informer, and this was all staged by the government. The idea was, hey, the government was thinking, we don't want, the workers of Russia who are hungry to join some kind of revolutionary group. So we're going to set up this fake protest group led by Father Gapon. Father Gapon is going to lead this peaceful march to the Tsar's palace. Well, the Bolsheviks realized that millions and millions of workers were following Father Gapon. And he was widely respected. So on the day that Father Gapon led his march to the Tsar's palace, the labor unions that were aligned with the Bolsheviks had a strike in solidarity. Now think about that, right? Everybody knew Father Gapon was a phony, right? He was an advocate of the czarist autocracy. He was an anti-communist. He was a phony, but he had a huge amount of influence, and he was leading these big demonstrations around the issue of hunger, right? And he was going to lead a peaceful march to the Winter Palace, right? And the Bolsheviks had the understanding that it would look good on their part, even though Father Gapon stood for something completely different, even though his goals were completely different. The issue was hunger. So the Bolsheviks had the idea that at the same time Father Gapon was leading his march to the Tsar's palace to beg the Tsar for food, that they would have strikes in solidarity. Brilliant. Well, it just so happened that even though Father Gapon's march to the Tsar's palace was completely without any political message and was just begging, and, well, that didn't stop members of the military, I think it was the Cossacks, from open firing onto the crowd and killing a number of the people protesting with Father Gapon. And of course, when that happened, when the peaceful protest led by the police informer was met with brutal violence by the government, that led to the strikes that the Bolsheviks had called expanding. And all across the country, people went on strike in response to that. And members of the military were so outraged to hear that the peaceful people marching behind this priest had been shot that they shot their officers. And there was an upsurge in the country, an explosion in the country in response to the attack on this peaceful march. And in the middle of these rebellions and protests that happened, in the middle of that, the Bolsheviks and others built these entities called Soviets that were councils or popular assemblies. They were councils that were formed, right? And they started in the areas where the rebellions were happening. These councils started functioning as dual power. This was the 1905 revolution in Russia. And it was defeated. It was crushed very brutally. A lot of people were executed. It failed. But that was they call that the dress rehearsal for the Russian Revolution, right? Because there had been a popular upsurge of protest. There had been these community organizations led by the Bolsheviks that had been formed in a number of areas. So it was kind of the dress rehearsal. Well, speed ahead to 1917, Russia is fighting World War I. World War I is not going so well for Russia. And in fact, the Tsar is largely viewed as an incompetent leader. The Tsar, he's got this whole scandal going on with Rasputin, and the Tsar is kind of viewed as kind of a bumbling fool. He's not running the military very well. And there are big political problems in Russia at the time of World War I. People are hungry, etc. So it was decided by probably the richest and most powerful people in Russian society that the Tsar had to go. The Tsar was not an effective leader, so the Tsar had to go. So there were some protests against the Tsar, and normally when these protests would happen, the police would just show up and arrest everybody. But in this instance, the military started protecting the protesters from the police, and pretty soon, the whole capital, you had people on strike throughout the city saying, "Down with the Tsar." The Tsar was forced to step down. Right? The majority of the ruling class wanted the Tsar gone, so they basically allowed protests, and they basically supported and sponsored rebellions among the people, strikes, protests, to make the Tsar go. So the Tsar was brought down, and a new government came into existence, the Provisional Government, led by Alexander Kerensky. Well, the question was, now that the Tsar was gone, would Russia continue fighting in World War I? Well, Kerensky wanted to keep fighting in World War I. Many Russian capitalists wanted to keep fighting in World War I, but not all of them. There were a number of Russian capitalists who were doing business with the Germans, did not want to fight in World War I. There was a widespread feeling among a lot of the population, but also even among the capitalist class, that World War I was not a good war. The Americans wanted Russia to keep fighting World War I. The British wanted Russia to keep fighting World War I. But the Germans certainly didn't. And there were a number of Russians, wealthy Russians, mind you, who didn't want to keep fighting Germany. And so all throughout the summer of 1917, they had protests, down with war, end the war. And there was widespread support for those protests, even though the majority of the Russian ruling class wanted to continue the war. Alexander Kerensky was continuing the war. People were dying in the war. But there were big divisions in the ruling class about the war. Should the war continue or not? The Bolsheviks became known as the anti-war guys. Their slogan was "Peace, Land, and Bread," but peace was the main one. There was one party that was against the war. It was the Bolsheviks. They were against World War I. Well, there was continued instability, protests, rebellions. The provisional government was very weak. So a guy in the military named Kornilov decided that the provisional government had to go. It was too weak, and that they needed some kind of authoritarian dictatorship to force Russia to continue fighting in World War I. So General Kornilov got his military together, and he announced that he was marching to St. Petersburg. He was going to seize St. Petersburg, and he was going to become the military dictator. So his army started marching to St. Petersburg. Well, a lot of capitalists in Russia didn't think that was a particularly good idea. Right? They didn't like the idea of a military dictatorship, especially because that would probably result in them being killed. So there were big divisions. Big divisions in the country. And even a lot of the pro-war capitalists, like Alexander Kerensky and the provisional government, did not want to be crushed by General Kornilov. So they started mobilizing the city to fight off the military. As General Kornilov was marching towards St. Petersburg, they started mobilizing the city. And they started opening up the armories and handing out guns among the population so that the population could be armed. And it got to the point that the militias, the community militias built by the Bolsheviks to defeat Kornilov's army, were actually bigger than the official military that was set to defend St. Petersburg. And then, as it became clear that Russia, St. Petersburg was just completely locked and loaded, and if the General Kornilov marched into the city and tried to become the dictator, he was going to have a bloodbath on his hands, and a lot of his soldiers were going to get killed, and a lot of General Kornilov's soldiers started defecting and running away. It got pretty clear that that army wasn't going to come. General Kornilov's troops, they turned around. They didn't seize St. Petersburg. And at that point, the Bolsheviks declared these entities, these Soviets, these councils that they had built throughout all these protests and strikes, to be the new government. They said the Soviets are the new government. All power to the Soviets. And the old government was basically just forced out because the Bolsheviks had a bigger army and these Soviet bodies existed and they became the Soviet government. That is how the Russian Revolution happened. It was a very, very long process of the Bolsheviks entering into strategic alliances with the ruling class, of big divisions in the ruling class taking place, of society entering a crisis, of organizations and institutions coming into power, of beating back. It was a long, complicated process that ultimately culminated in assemblies and bodies built by the people becoming the new state apparatus. That is how the Russian Revolution happened. So no, if someone says to you the Russian Revolution was a bunch of people got guns and went out, and that's not what happened. The Russian Revolution was a very, very long, complicated process of an organization called the Bolsheviks maneuvering and entering alliances and building community power and building itself up and eventually becoming the government. That is what the Russian Revolution was. Right? Chinese Revolution. It was what happened in the Chinese Revolution was that there was already a big, vaguely socialist, nationalist movement in China called the KMT, or the Gomandang. I'm probably butchering that. Forgive me, any Chinese speakers. But the KMT nationalist movement, led by Dr. Sun Yat-sen, had already overthrown the government of the emperor and had already taken power in China's cities. It was waging a war against the rural warlords who refused to recognize the government. The Republic of China had come into existence. And the party that was like at the center of the Republic of China was the nationalist KMT movement. And this party that came to power in China, it had three principles. It believed in independence, democracy, and the people's livelihood. People's livelihood was largely understood to mean socialism, though it was kind of vague, and that was the KMT movement. So what did the communists do? They joined the KMT movement, and the Communist Party of China was considered to be a faction of the KMT movement. And the Soviet Union built a military training school and started training Chinese people to be military generals in the KMT government's army. All right, Chiang Kai-shek, all kinds of people in the Chinese military got training from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had this training academy where it was training people to fight for the nationalist KMT government. So there was a whole layer of people inside the Chinese government who were sympathetic to the Soviet Union, got military training from the Soviet Union, thought the Soviet Union was pretty cool, understood Marxism. The Communist Party was considered a faction within the nationalist KMT party. Right? So the Communist Party had millions of members. It was a faction of the ruling party, of the progressive ruling party. Dr. Sun Yat-sen, who was the leader of China, attended gatherings of the Communist International, made clear he himself was not a communist, but he thought the Soviet Union was a good ally. But he died. After he died, there were divisions in the KMT party about who the new leader would be. And at that point, Chiang Kai-shek emerged as the new leader. Chiang Kai-shek didn't like the Soviets. He thought the Soviets didn't like him. He thought they were out to get him. So he started repressing communists and executing them. So the communists were forced to retreat into the rural areas. And in the rural areas, this is feudalism, right? Rural areas of China, the mountains and the rural areas, the countryside. A lot of people are living under feudal conditions. Well, the communists started becoming the champions of the rural people, right? And taking over areas, redistributing the land, building peasant associations. So because they were forced out of the cities and being violently repressed, and they were no longer allowed to be part of the ruling coalition, they moved into the countryside and started redistributing land. And they built up base areas within the countryside. And eventually, in 1931, they declared the Chinese Soviet Republic. The Chinese Soviet Republic. Google the Chinese Soviet Republic. Nobody knows about it. It's never talked about. 1931, they declared the Chinese Soviet Republic because they had seized enough territory that they had like a country within a country. They declared the Chinese Soviet Republic. But then, they faced an attack, and they were pushed back, and they were forced to flee, and the Chinese Soviet Republic was defeated. But then Mao did the long march, went up into the mountains and did the long march, and came down from the mountain and started building up liberated territory in the countryside again. And then Japan invaded China. 1937, Japan invaded, and the communists and the nationalists agreed to a peace treaty, a united effort to defeat the Japanese invaders. And during the war, the communists became the most well-respected fighters against Japan. They were viewed as the heroic fighters against Japan, while the KMT army was known for being very, very corrupt and having all kinds of bribery, and having, the People's Liberation Army was known as a group of people that were very, very dedicated and self-sacrificing, and, it was almost a religious fanaticism. Edgar Snow went to the areas of the People's Liberation Army and witnessed how dedicated and fanatical the people were, while the KMT was associated with corruption and bribery and cynicism, the People's Liberation Army, that also fought Japan, was associated with this exciting revolutionary zeal and fanaticism. People called them warrior monks almost. Well, Japan was defeated. After Japan was defeated, the communists and the KMT started the process of forming a unified government. But Chiang Kai-shek would not allow the communists to join the unified government, not allow them to participate in the elections. And he was demanding that they dissolve their army. He said, "You can't have two armies. You guys have this big army you built during the fight against Japan. Well, you got to dissolve your army now. You just have to have my army be the only army." Well, the people that had fought Japan and had built up these territories, Maradona, that had built up these territories, they weren't going to do that. They weren't going to give up their guns. They weren't going to, they weren't going to give up their armed organizations. And basically, the Chiang Kai-shek was demanding that the communists dissolve all of their organizations and that let him be the only government, not letting them participate in the elections. So based on that, because they were not allowed to be part of the government, and because there was active violence, repression being rained down on them, they were being, forced to give up control of areas, they were not being allowed to participate, they continued fighting, and they defended themselves, and ultimately they won a civil war, and they established the People's Republic of China. So again, did the Chinese Communist Party come to power by advocating a violent revolution? On the contrary, they were part of the KMT movement until they were violently forced out of it. They then entered an alliance with the KMT to defeat the Japanese. And even after that, they wanted to form a coalition government to peacefully work within the system to transition to socialism. They weren't allowed to do that, so they were being actively disarmed. So then they fought to defend themselves. The Bolshevik Revolution was an act of self-defense. Zionist. The Bolshevik Revolution was an act of self-defense. Right? The Chinese Revolution was an act of self-defense. Right? The Bolivarian Revolution in Venezuela. Right? They got elected peacefully. They were forced out with a military coup, but an uprising among the rank-and-file soldiers defeated the military coup. Right? That I'm just telling you, no socialist revolution in history has ever happened because communists went around saying, no, I saw it about Zionist influence, I wrote it down. No communist revolution in history has ever happened because communists went around advocating a violent revolution. Ever. Nowhere have communists ever taken power because they advocated violent revolution. That has never happened. Never have communists taken power because they advocated a violent revolution. And when violent revolutions have happened, it has been forced on the communists and forced on the people supporting the communists because they had no choice, because they were under attack. The people of Russia, who built the Soviets, and they were facing the attack of the Kornilov reaction, and they defended themselves from Kornilov, and it was through that process that the Soviet government emerged. In China, the People's Liberation Army and the liberated territories that the communists controlled were being attacked by Chiang Kai-shek and not allowed to participate in the government and not allowed to struggle peacefully. So then they defended themselves. And that's how you got the Chinese Revolution. Bolivarian socialism was elected peacefully. Right? Never have communists ever advocated violent revolution and taken power. And when communists, ultra-left elements have gone around advocating violent revolution, the result has been the fact that they're isolated from society, no one wants to associate with them, and they become irrelevant. The strength of communists has always been when they do what you should be doing, which is coherently putting forward a revolutionary program and building the revolutionary organization. And it was been through that process, putting forward the revolutionary program, building the revolutionary organization, that events develop through which communists could potentially take power. Now, the last thing that I want to go over is that there are two time periods in U.S. history where people look at them as potentially revolutionary, but they weren't. But obviously no socialist revolution happened. And I want to talk about those two time periods briefly. I want to touch on why there was revolutionary potential in those two time periods and why there was not a revolution in those two time periods. The first time period in which there was revolutionary potential in the United States was the 1930s. The 1930s, not only did you have a very big communist party in the United States, not only did you have a very big labor movement, but you also had, as a result of that, big divisions in the ruling class. Roosevelt was being threatened with a fascist military coup. There was the 1933 attempted business plot coup against Roosevelt. There was also, there was the National Association of Manufacturers, there was the Black Legion, the Ku Klux Klan, various fascist groups in the United States. They were prepared to overthrow Roosevelt with a violent revolution, right, and establish fascism. Roosevelt did not want that, so he made a strategic alliance with the Communist Party. And in 1936, in the presidential election, Roosevelt won the election. But, and after that, there were a bunch of layoffs, factory closings. So in response to that, there was the sit-down strike wave, where workers started occupying their factories. And there was a huge upsurge in the country of workers occupying their factories, the sit-down strike wave. Now, hypothetically, that could have escalated to the point of a socialist revolution. It could have, right? Roosevelt, was aligning with the communists. The fascist threat was very real. There was a division within the ruling class. There was a very active Communist Party. But it didn't result in that, right? I mean, basically, the ruling class was basically forced to take it, right? I mean, Roosevelt was the president, and he forced the ruling class to allow, allow sit-down strikes. And he got less radical after that over the next couple years. But there was a strong Communist Party. There were divisions in the ruling class, but the Roosevelt wing of the ruling class, they were able to enter a strategic alliance with the communists against fascism, but they were not forced by circumstances to change capitalist property relations. They weren't, right? I mean, there was no changing of capitalist property relations, right? And why wasn't there? Well, there was no necessity for it, right? That by defeating the fascist menace, the ruling class felt safe, and the Roosevelt coalition, it was progressive, but it stopped being as radical as it was in 1936 and 1937 during the crisis. Now, what could have happened, right? I mean, we're playing coulda, woulda, but, hypothetically speaking, let's say in response to the sit-down strike wave, in response to the sit-down strike wave, let's say that there had been, the military had tried to seize the government, right, and overthrow Roosevelt for supporting the sit-down strikes, hypothetically. Say that it happened. And say that Roosevelt, then told workers to rise up and defend democracy from the fascist threat. And imagine that communists were at the center of a group of people that rejected the military attacking Roosevelt and seized various cities or something like that, right? You can see a hypothetical communist revolution coming out of the 1930s, but it didn't happen, right? Didn't happen because that's not the way events developed, right? One section of the ruling class was fighting with another. The Communist Party was very strong, but things just kind of remained stable, right? Well, is it possible that the Roosevelt coalition, if attacked, if facing an all-out fascist threat, is it possible that the Roosevelt coalition, in response to, real terror and violence from the ruling class, would become full-blown socialists, and would be forced to defend democracy and allow the communists to take leadership in the Roosevelt coalition? Of course, that's certainly possible, but it didn't happen that way. So that's the first situation, right? The second situation, I think, is the political crisis of 1968 to 1972. And honestly, this was a big political crisis in the United States, but there was no real economic crisis. There was somewhat of a downturn in the early 70s, but there was no real economic crisis. This was still part of the post-World War II economic boom. But, there were 1968, you had rebellions in every major city after the killing of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., you had protests on college campuses against the Vietnam War. You had a military that was basically, divided, and soldiers, refusing to fight in Vietnam, and the U.S. military was almost falling apart in Vietnam. And so there was a division in the ruling class. How do we deal with this? Nixon came in as kind of the strong man, and Nixon had a huge base of support among the population, right? Among people who did not, who were not college students, who were not low-income African Americans. There was a broad layer of people who supported Richard Nixon and were going to oppose any revolution, any move toward socialism that would happen, right? And there was not a class struggle in the United States. While there were labor unions, the Teamsters, the most radical labor union, supported Richard Nixon, right? And that Richard Nixon had his silent majority, this huge layer of U.S. society, white workers, Archie Bunker, right, who they were not supporters of the protests against the Vietnam War. They supported the Vietnam War, and they were not really big fans of the civil rights movement. And there was this huge layer of U.S. society that was not sympathetic to the revolutionary forces. The revolutionary forces were the black community that was rebelling. There was the Black Panthers. There were Students for a Democratic Society on the college campuses. But the overwhelming majority of the U.S. working class, the white working class, did not want a revolution. So while there was a big political crisis, and while there were millions of people talking about socialism and revolution, there was a labor aristocracy of Archie Bunker guys who just weren't going to have it. And when Nixon, brought the hammer down and the FBI crushed the Black Panther Party, these folks thought that was a good move. And furthermore, when students were shot at Kent State University for protesting the Vietnam War, I grew up near Kent State. I heard it every year. On May 4th, I would hear people say they should have shot more of them. They were disrespecting the country. They deserved it. So there was just too big of a labor aristocracy and too strong of an economy in the United States for that crisis of 1968 to 1972 to have actually turned into a revolution. It wouldn't have happened because the support for the state and the support for capitalism among society, there was a strata of the population that was just so strongly in support of what was going on and did not have a revolutionary impulse. It was only in certain isolated strata of U.S. society that there was revolutionary discontent. And what Nixon did when he took office was basically take moves to try and neutralize those strata, right? He lowered the voting age to 18 so that young people would feel more engaged with the political process. He escalated the Vietnam War, and when it was clear he couldn't win, he withdrew from Vietnam. He ended the Vietnam War, right? Richard Nixon, he enacted affirmative action policies, right? He was very friendly to the Teamsters Union. They were one of his strong allies, and that Richard Nixon was kind of a Bonapartist figure who came in to resolve the crisis. But because there was no class struggle really to speak of, because there was no widespread anti-capitalist sentiment, because it was only isolated pockets of the population, You weren't able to transition towards socialism. There was not a desire to transition towards socialism. Outside of New York City, outside of urban centers, outside of the black community, average white American working people did not want a revolution and did not have a very high opinion of the anti-Vietnam War protesters or of the urban black rebellions. They saw them in a very negative light. So, while there were very, very radical sentiments among young people who didn't want to fight in Vietnam and among the black community, it wasn't among the widespread population. That's why you didn't have a revolution. Was there a political crisis? Yes. So there you go. So those are two moments, but hypothetically speaking, right? I'll do what I did with the 1930s. Say the U.S. economy had crashed in the middle of that, right? Say that, in the middle of urban rebellions in the black community, people protesting the Vietnam War, the U.S. economy had crashed. And say that based on that, these students that were protesting against the Vietnam War and the Black Panthers raised some revolutionary demands that would meet the needs of the people. Say that during the political crisis of the 1960s, not only had there been a political crisis, but millions of Americans suddenly were losing their jobs and homes. And imagine that the Black Panthers and Students for a Democratic Society were able to come out with a slogan, guaranteeing that if they were to take power, that they would give everyone a job and give everyone health care. Imagine that a communist candidate were to run for office with the support of Students for a Democratic Society and the Black Panthers on a platform of, giving everyone a job, giving everyone health care, and millions of Americans were suffering and desperately needed it. And in the context of that political crisis, then voted for that communist candidate. And of course, you could imagine hypothetically situations, developing out of the Nixon era crisis that could lead to a revolution. But without some big changes, there would be no way that you could really see a revolution. Without that big layer of U.S. society not, developing class consciousness and being sympathetic, it wouldn't have happened, right? It was that silent majority that was the base of Richard Nixon that prevented a revolution in the 1960s and 70s. And it was the fact that the contradictions of U.S. society during the 1930s did not escalate to the point that there was open warfare between factions of the ruling class in the 1930s that prevented revolution in the 1930s, right? That revolutions happen when the fighting amid the ruling class becomes so intense that working people are brought into the political process. This is what you need to understand. That all revolutions start out as a fight within the ruling class. Right? As capitalism naturally develops, right? As the falling rate of profit becomes a bigger and bigger problem, overproduction, right? As the worker cannot buy back the product he's producing, as society starts to have more and more instability, more and more frequent economic crises, the ruling class start to fight with each other. And as that happens, as the ruling class start to fight with each other, they start using the workers as foot soldiers in their fights with each other, just like they do internationally, right? When the USA is invading Iraq, they send the workers to go invade Iraq as their foot soldiers. Well, when the capitalists of the United States, one faction of the capitalist class, is fighting another faction, they don't go out and do it. They don't go out and have protests in the streets. They don't go out and form militias. They don't go out and... No, they recruit workers to do the fighting for them. They have workers be their foot soldiers and activists, right? On the left, they build things like, Occupy Wall Street. And on the right, they build things like the Tea Party, right? They use workers to fight their battles, right? The right builds right-wing movements. That's the lower levels of capital. The higher levels of capital build left-wing movements. And that's what happens. That's what happens in a capitalist crisis. The workers become political and are forced into politics because the ruling class is encouraging them to get political, because the ruling class needs foot soldiers to fight the other wing of the capitalist class. Most of the time, working people are not encouraged to think about politics. But in a time of crisis, the ruling class starts encouraging workers to think about politics. And the job of revolutionaries, and the job of those of us who want socialism, is to maneuver within this mess, not with the goal of strengthening one wing of the ruling class against the other, but within this mess, where the ruling class is energizing workers to be foot soldiers for their faction against the other faction, as there are Bonapartist struggles in the ruling class, our job is to put on a suit and tie and coherently present the revolutionary program and build the revolutionary organization. It's our job not to advocate a violent revolution, not to sound like lunatics, but to dress responsibly, to look respectable, to go to working people and present a revolutionary program and put forward a revolutionary program and build the revolutionary organizations within all of this and maneuver within all of this and make alliances with one section of the ruling class sometimes, the other section of the ruling class another time, and build the revolutionary organizations. And as this happens, as the crisis develops, as the revolutionary organization gets stronger, and obviously it is certainly possible that within the crisis, within all of this, the revolutionary organization could get strong enough that it could then take power. But that would only happen on the basis of big divisions within the ruling class, on the basis of big contradictions, on the basis of maneuvering and all kinds of things that would eventually lead to a situation where there was a big chunk of U.S. society that was aligned with that was aligned with the revolutionary organization. And if a big chunk of society was aligned with the revolutionary organization would obviously be in a position where it could start to take control of the government. Right? It would get elected. It would have its own community organizations. Now, is it possible that in such a situation, I think it's more than possible, that the other sections of the ruling class might be violent? Right? Look how violent they were to Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln got elected democratically, but they took up arms and violently tried to break the country apart. And so Lincoln was forced to defend democracy and build up a coalition. Right? The U.S. Civil War was the Second American Revolution. There was a communist fighting division in the U.S. Civil War. It was called the Ohio 9th Regiment. They waved the red flag as their official flag. Joseph Wedemeyer and August Willich, two German communists, one of them became a brigadier general. There was a whole communist division of the U.S. Army during the U.S. Civil War. Why? Because in order to defeat the slaveholders, Lincoln was forced to enter a strategic alliance with the communists. Right? And so in response to the terrorist violence of the Confederates, the people, the Republic, American democracy was forced to defend itself. Right? Spain, right? The people, communists, got elected, took office. They were part of a coalition to defeat a coalition that brought down the monarchy and a progressive government, the Spanish Republic. You had the rise of Franco. This is how revolutions happen. They happen because communists build the revolutionary program and build the revolutionary organization, enter alliances with one section of the ruling class against another. This is how revolutions happen. This is what you need to understand, right? They don't happen because communists go around advocating violence, go around doing illegal things, go around acting like crazy lunatics and screaming and yelling. They happen because they look responsible and respectable and build the revolutionary organization and put forward a coherent revolutionary program. This is how these things happen. This is how these things happen. Okay? And I hope that this has been educational for everybody, because it's something that a lot of people don't understand, right? I mean, when you've got communist groups putting forward silly notions about they're going to have a civil war, or they're going to, they're going to have the gradual peaceful transition in which the Republicans just kind of go away and we build it one step at a time. Or, we've got the Red Dawn scenario, which is absolutely ridiculous, right? None of these are coherent ideas. What I am telling you right now, this is how a revolution could potentially happen in the United States. The capitalists could fight with each other, and as a result of the crisis, the revolutionary organizations of the people could grow, and we could, those of us who are socialists could start to have a more increasingly important role in the government. And our organizations could become essential. And in that process, we could begin the transition to socialism. This is how revolutions could happen. So just understand what I'm telling you here. This is what I'm telling you now is scientific socialism. What I'm telling you now is dialectical and historical materialism. It's Marxism. And this is what you need to understand. I gave a class on this topic called The Actual Nature of Revolution. You should check it out. I just wanted to clear all of that up. So I hope that was helpful to all of you. So there you go. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. And now I think we're going to have our roll call, where I call you out as I see you, names and locations. Names and locations, folks. Names and locations. Salt Lake City, Nevada High Desert, Australia, Norway, Washington State, Rafael, Brazil, David, Italy, Henderson, Nevada, Woodstock, Queens, New York City, Robert from Hawaii, Sergey from Arkansas, Whitby Island, Washington State, Miami, Florida, somewhere USA, Montevideo, Uruguay, Los Angeles, Rio de Janeiro, Canada, North Carolina, Felix, Reactionary, Florida, Indonesia, Sham from Cleveland, San Miguel de Allende, Mexico, Beirut, Cleveland, Pirate Alex, or Anthony Penza, Missouri via North Carolina, Kendall in San Diego, Springfield, Missouri, watching from Tampa, Florida, Herb Bryant, Kentucky, Milwaukee, Nevada, Nicaragua, Milwaukee, Southwest UK, all the best, heart of Texas, deep in the heart of Texas. Right? You know where I am, Caleb. Oh, boy. Right? Kieran from San Diego, San Jose, Hawthorne, New Jersey, Long Island, New York, Kenny from Malaysia, Julie from Pennsylvania, Sasha, Cincinnati, Ohio, Jenny Lynn. Welcome, Jenny. Destiny's Mom's House, Union, New Jersey, Mexico, Fairhope, Alabama. Bill from the United States is here. Trump from D.C., Czech Republic, LOL. LOL. Lethbridge, Alberta, Canada. Leipzig, East Germany. Very good. Orange juice. No, I am drinking water. It's water tonight. It would be unnamed diet beverage if it was earlier in the day, but I want to sleep tonight as I have work in the morning. A lot of you don't have work in the morning, but tomorrow is not a holiday for me. Clydebank. Long live the CPI. All right, New Jersey. My wife and I had dinner at a lovely Italian restaurant. It was great. Yes, very good. Okay, folks, so keep the super chat questions rolling in. I know many of you have many questions, so keep the super chats rolling in. I'll be very happy to answer your super chat questions. Dust James in Lee County, North Carolina. So, yeah, please share this on Facebook, on Reddit, on Twitter. Make this a bigger conversation. The more people hear, the merrier. I'm glad we're having a great conversation. Happy Thanksgiving to everybody. Brazil is watching. Very, very good. So, yeah, keep the super chats coming in. If you got a question, you better ask me, or else I won't be able to answer it. So, super chat questions, keep them rolling in. That's why, that's what I can do. So, alrighty. The first question was about me becoming a journalist. How did I become a journalist? Well, I started writing articles for the Workers' World newspaper when I was in college. I did a lot of writing in other places. I think I wrote newspapers for the little newspaper in my little town in Ohio. I got paid. I wrote for my college newspaper. And I actually got fired from my college newspaper because a donor to the college actually said that they wanted me out of the college paper. And it was a private school. And so I was just informed that I was not welcome to write for the college paper anymore. That's kind of an amusing story. But before I wrote for before I got fired from being a writer at the college newspaper. All right. Tiananmen. before I got fired from writing for the college newspaper, it was interesting. So I had been writing articles for like a long time for the college paper, and some of them honestly weren't very good. I was very young, and I was just very new, and I was just writing little op-eds for the college paper, and some of them were decent, and some of them, I was young. Thank you, Herb Bryant, for your super chat, much appreciated. I remember that there was a guy named Tim Davey who started writing articles in response to my articles every week. He wrote like rebuttals to my articles. And so I saw an opportunity. So I challenged Tim Davey to a debate. And that debate is actually on the internet. You can go on the internet. It's actually on my YouTube channel still. It's the full 2-hour debate between me and Timothy S. Davey. Is online at my college. It's on there, right? It was, I think, 2008 this happened. I debated Timothy Davey. We had our debate. It was a big hit. There were over 100 people on my college campus who came to watch us debate. It was wild. We did this debate at Baldwin Wallace. You can watch it. It's on the YouTube channel, right? I'm much younger in it, and I'm not sure I would put everything forward the way I did then. I was a member of the Workers' World Party at the time. But I thought I did a pretty decent job. And most people watching said I completely destroyed Tim Davey. But we had our debate, and 100 people came because we put up posters all over the campus. And that I noticed that people love to watch debates. People don't want to watch, class on what socialism is, but the idea of a debate, people think it's going to be a boxing match, right? People think it's going to be like a fist fight or something, or they're going to be... So people came. And it was wild because the debate, this college I went to was in this little college town outside of Cleveland. Not much goes on in that college town. I'm not going to say that, and that's not true. But anyway, it was in this little college town. And it was a little college town, and not much went on in the town. Let me just put it that way. And, little college town, and not much really went on. And it was announced that there was going to be this debate, socialism versus capitalism. So, I told all the activists in Cleveland that there was going to be a debate, and some activist folks came. But then, on top of that, in addition to that, there were some right-wingers who came. And that was amusing as well. The local John Birch Society sent a few people. So the John Birch Society came. And I think there was a guy who was like a candidate for the Libertarian Party. He was just a local libertarian guy who ran for everything, and he was a member of the John Birch Society, David Macco, right? And he was kind of, we used to call him Wacko Macco, because he would come to like left-wing demonstrations with leaflets saying all kinds of crazy right-wing things. He was a John Birch Society member. So he showed up with like 5 people from the John Birch Society. So the John Birch Society was there. The local anti-war activists, people from the Northeast Ohio Anti-War Coalition were there. It was quite a show. A Workers' World Party member from New York City flew in for it. She came in, one of the national leaders came into town. It's a great debate. It's on YouTube. You can watch it. It's still on there. And there's little sections of it that are on there too, but it went pretty well. I like I said, I wouldn't put things in the same way I did. But yeah, so, I've been doing, why am I talking about this again? I'm answering, how did I become a journalist? So I guess, after college, I was in Cleveland. I was doing activism in Cleveland. I was doing writing. I wrote for the Workers' World newspaper and some other publications. I think I wrote for a newspaper in Detroit for a while called Critical Moment. It was kind of an activist-y paper in Detroit that I wrote for a little bit. And, I think I wrote, I don't know, I've been writing articles here, writing articles there. I was always doing that kind of stuff. I moved to New York. I was part of the Occupy Wall Street protests. And when I was part of the Occupy Wall Street protests, I started doing a lot of interviews, with international media. And then I did some writing for websites, and one thing led to another, and I ended up working with TV networks, and that's where I am today. I mean, it's a very long process. And nowadays, many people ask me, how can I get into journalism like you are? Well, my answer is do it. Do it. I mean, nowadays, just do it. I mean, start writing articles, start making videos, start doing it. I mean, do it. That's my advice. If you want to get into journalism nowadays, do it. That's my advice to you, right? I mean, nowadays there's a lot of people who do journalism, and the way they do it is they just do it. They go out and start doing it. And that is my advice. If you want to be a journalist, do it. That's how I became a journalist, is I did it. I wrote articles. I wrote articles. I made videos. I gave interviews. One thing led to another. So if you want to be a journalist, do it. Now, obviously study about how to do it. Try to make sure you do it well. But the main thing nowadays is to just do it. So just do it. That's my advice. If you want to become a journalist, start doing journalism. Start putting out journalistic content. You learn by doing, number one. You learn by doing. And on top of that, people will see the quality of the work that you're doing. And, based, if what you're doing is good, you'll attract, people, and you'll attract, you'll attract attention, and your ability, your prestige as a journalist will rise. But, just do it. Okay. The USA has bloody labor wars. Well, I mean, yes. I mean, we had strikes. We've had, the general strikes that I went over before. We've had, we've had bloody labor wars, but it's not. I mean, many countries have had labor strikes and labor struggles. So not just the United States, but I'm not sure if I would put it that way. PSL. Well, the PSL, the Party for Socialism and Liberation. I know a lot of people in that group. They're very good people. The UK was involved in the creation of Israel. So what's their strategic? Oh, okay. All right. UK. Israel. All righty. So, as far as the PSL, look, I mean, there's a lot of good people in the group, and they have a very good international perspective. They are thoroughly anti-imperialist, which is, really saying something, because most lefty groups nowadays are not very anti-imperialist. The main thing the PSL is about is having protests. Someone jokingly told me once that PSL stands for protesting stuff lots, because that's kind of what PSL is about. They protest stuff lots, and that, it's Party of Socialism and Liberation. My feeling is that we don't need to protest stuff lots. We need to get to the masses. I've been long saying that we need to get out of the movement, get to the masses. At the time that PSL was being formed, I don't know if they feel this way anymore. What they were telling people was that we need to take over the movement so we can take power. Their goal is to be king of the protest cage. Their idea is that if we can get the permit, we can set up the stage, we can be in charge of the protests. If anyone wants to speak, they have to go through us. That is what it means to be the vanguard party. And I don't agree with them about that. I don't think we need to take over the movement. I think we need to get to the masses. I think the movement is a dead end. I think we need to get to the masses. So that is my disagreement with the PSL. But that said, there's a lot of great people in the PSL, and I think there's probably a lot of people in PSL who agree with what I'm saying. I mean, look, there are people who are part of my Patreon community that are in the PSL. There are people that are friends of mine that are in the PSL. So, just because I don't agree with them tactically, and I don't agree with them tactically. I don't think that trying to take over the movement, trying to be king of the protest cage is what is needed. I think we need to get to the masses with a socialist program. We need to build organizations among the masses, but, PSL, that's where they're at. So, that's PSL. I respect them, and it's better that, I'm glad they do the work that they do. I mean, I'm glad those protests are happening. If it weren't for those protests, I mean, imagine that nobody protested, I mean, and, so you need the protests, but I don't think they're the answer. And there are different currents within the PSL, and one of my largest criticisms of PSL, based on my experience, has been that there is an anti-intellectual tone that comes out of many people within the organization. If you ask a PSL member, if you argue with them about their tactics, they're going to shoot back at you with, well, we actually do something. If you are someone who comes around the PSL who is, if you know a lot about Lenin or Marx, you're going to be viewed with suspicion. You're going to get a speech about how, yeah, well, we don't read books here. We actually do stuff. We're an activist group. And they have kind of an anti-intellectual bent to them. And it accompanies their movementism, right? That they protest stuff lots, right? They don't know who Lenin is. They don't know who Trotsky is. They don't know who Marx is. They're just real activists, okay? And you're a big fat nerd. They have an anti-intellectual bent to them, and that is what was always off-putting to me about them. And I mean, the group that I was in, PSL broke away from, and they had the same problem. And that's probably my biggest disagreement with the PSL. But overall, good anti-imperialist line and all of that. They're not a party that I would ever be comfortable in. I'll tell you that much, right? Based on my experience, if I were, first of all, I can't join any political group based on the work that I do, right? I mean, at this point, I can't be in any political organization, so I'm not joining any party. But if hypothetically I weren't doing this kind of work, and if hypothetically I could join a group, I wouldn't join the PSL simply because I know that because I do these lives and I know about stuff, um, you know, I wouldn't be welcome in the group. They would see me as, as too intellectual or too bookish or something like that. There would be an attitude, that I was not welcome because they're real activists. And so that's my experience with them. And look, I think what we need is a think tank. I'm trying to build the Center for Political Innovation, CPI. That's what I'm trying to build. A think tank that will promote socialist politics among the broad masses of people. That's what I'm about. So there you go. Alrighty. Maradona. Right. Well, it's a soccer player in Argentina, from Argentina, who was a socialist, who was sympathetic to Cuba. He's being mourned by a lot of progressive people. He's someone who was very, very, very anti-imperialist. So there you go. I was joking. I've been a fan since 2011 Occupy. Well, that's good, Bob. I'm glad you're joking. Alrighty. All right. Zionist influence in the Russian Civil War. Well, that's actually rather interesting, right? Because, the Russian Civil War, right, there was a feeling, right, because okay, so let's back up, right? There's an anti-Semitic document that's, it's considered, it's just, people talk about it. It's been around. The Tsar's secret police published an anti-Semitic document in the 1900s called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, right? And it was this anti-Semitic document that was claiming there was some kind of international global Jewish conspiracy and that revolutions were somehow, the result of a Jewish conspiracy or something like that. So when the Russian Civil War broke out, right, the Bolsheviks took power. So then there was the Russian Civil War, right, whereas the forces that wanted to restore the Tsar and also some social democrats and also, the British military and the American military and 15 different countries' military, the Bolsheviks fought off everybody, right? I mean, they fought off all kinds of entities that didn't want the Bolsheviks to be in power. The forces that were against the Bolsheviks were very anti-Semitic. Very anti-Semitic. They thought, a lot of them, in the White Army, a lot of the White Army forces thought that Marxism and socialism and communism were a Jewish conspiracy. So on that basis, a lot of times the White Army would go and slaughter entire Jewish villages and kill all kinds of Jewish people and murder people simply for being Jewish. So on that basis, there were many in the Jewish community who were not Marxists, but supported the Bolsheviks because the Bolsheviks were against anti-Semitism. There was a Zionist division of the Red Army, right? Many people don't realize this, but the Red Army, the Soviet Army, had a Zionist division of Jews who did not believe in communism, but were Zionists that fought with the Bolsheviks because the Bolsheviks protected Jews from anti-Semitic violence. So on that basis. What's also interesting, though, is that the World Zionist Organization, Theodore Herzl, did not support the Bolsheviks. And actually, one of the main things that the World Zionist Organization did during the Russian Civil War was try to get Jews in Russia to leave Russia and move to Palestine. Right? You had the Balfour Declaration, in which Britain declared that it was going to start building Jewish settlements in Palestine. And so one of the main actions of the World Zionist Organization was to try and get Jews out of Russia and to Palestine. That was one of the main things they did. So I think that's particularly interesting. So yeah, while there were Zionists in Russia who supported the Bolsheviks, the World Zionist Organization did not support them. And one thing that you'll see various anti-Semites do is they'll point to a guy named Jacob Schiff, and they'll claim that Jacob Schiff funded the Bolshevik Revolution. That's not true. Jacob Schiff supported the February Revolution. He funded something called the Russian Freedom Group that was against the Tsar. Jacob Schiff did not like the Tsar because the Tsar was anti-Semitic. But Jacob Schiff was against the Bolsheviks. So this wealthy man who was a Zionist and supporter of Israel, he did not fund the Bolshevik Revolution, right? That is a lie. And I've researched this. It's simply not true. And it's claimed by anti-Semites, and it's not true. Jacob Schiff funded the Russian Freedom Group, and the Russian Freedom Group did not support the Bolsheviks. So the idea that this Jacob Schiff, this Wall Street banker, paid for the Bolshevik Revolution is not true. That is so obviously not true, if you look into the details. But, a Wall Street banker named Jacob Schiff gave money to a group in Russia. Does not mean the Russian Revolution was a Wall Street conspiracy. And it's obnoxious because people who insist that the Russian Revolution was a Wall Street conspiracy always just say that. Like it's a fact. And you say, how was it? And they say, well, it was. And then they don't even want to give you the facts. They just believe it. If you press, people to give you the facts, they'll then point to Jacob Schiff. And you'll say, you look into the details, Jacob Schiff did not fund the Bolsheviks. Jacob Schiff funded the Russian Freedom Group. And the Russian Freedom Group was a pro-Tsarist group. Or an anti-Tsarist group that was anti-Bolshevik as well. So these conspiracy theories that the Russian Revolution was all a big Zionist conspiracy, that's wrong. It's just wrong. I mean, the facts just aren't there. And the majority of the Russian ruling class was against the Tsar. The American ruling class didn't like the Tsar. The Tsar of Russia was seen as an impediment to the victory of the Allies in World War I. They felt the Tsar was incompetent and that he was losing the war. So proving that one Zionist guy didn't like the Tsar, well, the Tsar had a history of anti-Semitism and persecuting Jews. So yes, the Zionist community, the Jewish community overwhelmingly, Zionist or Marxist or whatnot, Orthodox, whatever. They didn't like the Tsar because the Tsar was anti-Semitic. So you're just kind of missing. You're missing the point. And people who promote that conspiracy theory, they're just wrong because it's not true. Okay, Tiananmen Square. Did it really happen? What do you mean? Did it really happen? I mean, there were protests in China in 1989 in Tiananmen Square. And those protests were suppressed, so it happened. I mean, it happened. Yes, there were protesters in Tiananmen Square. Yes, that martial law was declared. So, I mean, I think that if you look into the specific details of how it happened, it gets a little bit murky and confusing, right? And I've written articles about this, and I've given interviews about this. As someone just said, the devil is in the details. Well, yeah, I mean, was there a protest in Tiananmen Square in 1989? Of course there was. Was it suppressed? Did they declare martial law and shut down the protest? Yes, they did. And were a lot of people killed? Yes. They were not killed in the square, though. And this is where it's interesting, right? Nicholas Kristof and Bruce Miles from BBC, and the ambassador of Chile, and all kinds of eyewitnesses have pointed out that the killing happened outside the square. Right? The students dispersed peacefully. And the military came into the square, and the students left. And after the students left the square, there was a huge amount of killing that went on outside of Tiananmen Square. There were army soldiers that were killed. There were student protesters that were killed. There were squads of people with chains and baseball bats running around, and there was a lot of people killing all kinds of people, and there were members of the Chinese military killing other members of the Chinese military. You have to remember, there was a section of the Chinese military that was with the protesters in the square. No one talks about that. So, there were Chinese army soldiers killing other Chinese army soldiers, and after the student protesters left Tiananmen Square, in the following weeks, there was ongoing street fighting and violence in the capital and in the areas of the city surrounding the square. That happened. Now, that famous photo, there is a very famous photo of the young person, in front of the tank. That happened the next day. The square had already been cleared, and they had set up tanks in the square to make sure nobody came back. And that's when that famous photo was taken. So it wasn't when they cleared the square. People have it in their head that they went to clear the square and this guy stood in front of a tank. That's not what happened, right? They'd already cleared the square, and then the guy went to the square where the tanks were and made his statement, and that photo went viral. So you have to put the Tiananmen events in the context of what was happening all over the world at that time, okay? Right? What was happening, you had the Eastern Bloc, all over Europe, Eastern Europe, country after country was having the color revolutions, and it's pretty clear that what was happening was that just like in East Germany, just like in Czechoslovakia, just like in Romania, there was division in Chinese society. There were a lot of young people that didn't like the Communist Party, that felt like their free speech was restricted, and they went out and protested. Okay? There also were, and this is the important thing, building socialism at a municipal level in the USA, socialism at a municipal level. Another thing, though, that is important to note is that there were neo-Maoists in Tiananmen Square. Nobody talks about this. There were Gang of Four supporters in Tiananmen Square. In fact, there's a book that was published by Harvard University that says during the protests in Tiananmen Square, there were more pictures of Mao than there had ever been since the Cultural Revolution. That there were a lot of people in Tiananmen Square who weren't wanting Western democracy, but were wanting Maoism. We're wanting like Gang of Four Maoism. So that's one thing that nobody ever talks about. The fact that there were a lot of students in Tiananmen Square waving the little red book and had big pictures of Mao. Nobody talks about that, right? That some of the protesters in Tiananmen Square didn't want Western capitalism. They wanted to go back to the hardline communism of the Mao era, right? Nobody talks about that. Another thing that nobody talks about, which, again, I'm going to get a lot of flack for pointing this out, but it must be said. In the lead up to Tiananmen Square, in the lead up to the protests at Tiananmen Square, 1989, there were protests happening on college campuses all over China. All over China, there were protests happening. And Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times is my source on this. So unless the New York Times made this up as communist propaganda before the protests happened to set the stage, this is in the New York Times. There are New York Times articles that say what I'm about to say here. In the lead up to Tiananmen Square, as students across China were protesting, right? There was the student movement that was happening in the lead up to, the protests in the square. What was the issue that students all across China on their campuses were protesting around? They didn't want to go to school with black people. There were race riots all over Chinese college campuses in the lead up to the Tiananmen Square protests. Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times wrote article after article after article about this. In the lead up to the Tiananmen Square protests, they were lynching black students on Chinese campuses. The Chinese government had a scholarship program where black students got to go study in China, and a lot of local Chinese folks were racist and didn't like having the black students there and were protesting against the presence of black students, protesting against the fact that black students were allowed to date Chinese students, and protesting, saying that the Chinese government was not loyal to the Chinese homeland. There were race riots. So a lot of the students who were part of the Tiananmen Square protests in 1989 were racist. Nobody ever talks about that. Nobody ever talks about this. Well, my source is the New York Times and Nicholas Kristof. What is the proper way to deal with private property in an urban setting? Okay. And, I've written articles about this. I've cited this. People just refuse to believe this. Well, the New York Times admitted in the lead up to the Tiananmen Square protests in 1989, the students all across China were rioting not for freedom of speech, not for freedom of assembly, but because they didn't want to go to school with black people, right? There were race riots happening. Black students on China's college campuses were being lynched, and it culminated in, but there were also neo-Maoists too, right? Let's remember, there were some of the students in Tiananmen Square were neo-Maoists who wanted hardline communism. Some of the students in Tiananmen Square were racist and didn't want to go to school with black people and were racist. Some of the students probably did want, Western capitalism. And some of the students probably didn't even know what it was about, right? This is how color revolutions work, right? What was the green movement in Iran about? Green. It's about green, right? This is what happens when the George Soros, Zbigniew Brzezinski color revolution method is you create a situation, you create a protest movement that is so vague that anybody feels like they can be part of it, and you just kind of foment chaos in the capital to set the stage for what you want to happen. This is how the CIA does their revolutions, right? The protests, Euromaidan was a very similar thing. What was Euromaidan about? Well, they wanted to join the European Union. They didn't like corruption or something. We know that the U.S. government was manipulating it, but there were all kinds of people that were joining the Maidan protests in Ukraine who thought didn't know what it was about, right? And that this happens, right? That when there are protests being staged by the CIA, often people with very real grievances join them. Often people project their own grievances onto it, right? I mean, look, Occupy Wall Street, right? Now, Occupy Wall Street, it was a protest movement that was being supported. I mean, the George Soros apparatus, I was part of it. I was there. I was happy to be there, and I agreed that, there is, the 1% and then the 99%, and there's an ultra rich that rules U.S. society, I agree, but, George Soros and Caleb Maupin had very different agendas, right? I was part of Occupy Wall Street. So was George Soros. Who else was part of Occupy Wall Street? The American Nazi Party, right? The American Nazi Party put up on their website a statement supporting Occupy Wall Street. Well, am I part of the American Nazi Party? No. Is George Soros a member of the American Nazi Party? No. But did all of us support Occupy Wall Street? I guess. Based on what? Because what was Occupy Wall Street about? We are the 99%. What does that mean? It's a vague thing. And when like the liberal wing of American capital that's in with the intelligence, when they do stuff, they make it really, really, really vague, right? That was a big thing at Occupy. No demands, right? Because if we had a demand, then it would have been about something. And then people would have stopped supporting it based on whether they agreed with the demand or not, right? So when there's color revolutions, they call them, the reason they call them color revolutions is because it's not about anything. It's about a color, right? Ukraine had the Orange Revolution. What was it about? Orange. Do you think there is truth in the story that Trotsky went to Russia to join the revolution from New York? Yeah, I'll talk about that. Well, of course he did. He lived in New York at the time. We'll talk about that. Trotsky from New York. All right. Happy to be back, Caleb. Where would you retire? I'm too young to retire. I'm only 32. So there you go. All right. But yeah, Tiananmen Square, it was a lot of students with a lot of real grievances who were angry at the Chinese Communist Party. Some of them probably just wanted freedom of speech and wanted more civil liberties and were frustrated. Some of them were racist and didn't want black students on their campus. And that's documented by the New York Times. Some of them Some of them were neo-Maoists who wanted to go back to the Gang of Four, and some of them wanted all kinds of things. And, it was going on at the same time as what was happening all across the Eastern Bloc. And it seems to me that there was an attempt to manipulate the events in the hopes of overthrowing the Chinese Communist Party, and that didn't happen. And there was a horrendous amount of killing afterwards, where a lot of people got killed. Chinese soldiers got killed, students got killed, random civilians who were just caught in the crossfire got killed. What happened in Tiananmen Square was very, very sad and very, very wrong, okay? It should never have happened. But I don't see it in the one-sided way American media wants us to put it, right? They want to make it sound that they have this story in their minds in American media that all the students were just, singing Kumbaya, and the evil Chinese government saw them and said, "My God, I hate your song of peace. Run them over with the tanks." And they were all ruthlessly crushed, and this proves that communism is evil. That's not what happened. It was much more complicated than that. Now, did the Chinese Communist Party do things that were not right in that situation? Probably. Were there students that were doing things that were not right, like murdering Chinese military soldiers? Probably. Were there students in the lead up to the protests that were doing things that were not right, like killing black students and lynching black students on their college campuses? Yes. It's more complicated. It's complicated. It's complicated. Tiananmen Square is complicated. And anyone who tries to sell you that stupid, narrative about it that I heard my whole life, it makes me so angry. I'm sorry, I'm getting angry again. But there's this stupid narrative I got about Tiananmen Square my whole life, right? That the students were just sitting there singing Kumbaya, and they wanted American capitalism, right? I mean, they wanted China to turn into the United States. No. But they all just wanted China to magically turn into the United States, and they were just singing Kumbaya, and they were just so happy, and the evil communists sat there and said, "God damn it, we hate freedom! We hate freedom!" And sent in the tanks and crushed them all with the tanks and went, "Mwahahaha, we are evil communists who crushed them with tanks. We are Chinese, but we have Russian accent." And that's what happened in Tiananmen Square. That's not what happened. It was more complicated than that. It was far, far more complicated than that, okay? And I'm so tired of that stupid narrative getting rolled out again. I'm so sick of hearing that stupid narrative, okay? What happened in Tiananmen Square was awful. A lot of people died who shouldn't have died. But among those people who died were members of the Chinese military who were killed by students with Molotov cocktails and snipers. Did you know there was a sniper on the roof of buildings? On the roof of the building that all the U.S. diplomats lived in, there was a sniper who was shooting Chinese military soldiers. I bet you didn't know that, right? So I'm just telling you, folks, it's more complicated than you think. That doesn't mean the Chinese government didn't do anything wrong. But that doesn't mean that the narrative that I just gave you is true. The wahahaha evil, and I'm so sick of how everything is presented in the United States as black and white, right? There's never any ambiguity. There's never any understanding that there might be another side to the story, and it makes me angry. It makes me very, very angry. I mean, the fact that during the violence didn't happen in the square, it happened elsewhere, according to a number of sources. That's kind of a big deal. The fact that there was a sniper on the roof of the building that all the U.S. diplomats live in who was gunning down Chinese soldiers, that's a little bit of a big deal. The fact that I think I've run this point into the ground, but I think you get what I'm saying here. Now, I'm sure someone's going to clip this and say, "Caleb denies that the Chinese government ever killed anyone in Tiananmen Square, and he's a naked apologist for China, and he doesn't believe in human rights." That's not what I said at all. So I gave a very long, complex explanation of a very long, complicated event. I said that the students probably had legitimate grievances. I said it's very possible the Chinese government did bad things, but I said it's more complicated. But I'm sure this will be clipped, and they'll say, "See, he said that the whole events of Tiananmen in 1989 never happened. He said that it never happened." And that's not what I said. That is not what I said. I gave a very intricate analysis of what happened in great detail, talking about a lot of things that happened and why they happened and why it's more complicated. But I'm sure, liars lie, right? And liars lie. So if liars lie, you can't stop them from lying. Anyway, why did the United States, or the United Kingdom helped create Israel? What was their interest? Well, okay. All right. So here's the deal. All right. So World War I was happening. And you remember, there was a secret treaty called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, right? During World War I, there was an agreement made among the Allied powers, Russia, France, Britain, the United States, called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And the idea was, after the Ottoman Empire was defeated, after the Germans and Austro-Hungarian Empire was defeated, the Arab world, the Middle East, would be divided according to this agreement, right? And, the French got Syria, and, the Saudi royal family got, the Arabian Peninsula, and the British got Iraq, and it was the Sykes-Picot Agreement, right? Well, after World War I, right, there was the Russian Revolution, and the Russian Revolution revealed the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Right? They made it public. It was a secret treaty, but the Bolsheviks pulled a WikiLeaks, basically. Right? The original WikiLeaks was the Russian Revolution, and the Bolsheviks, they pulled a Julian Assange, and they made public the Sykes-Picot Agreement, where they'd carved up the Middle East. So after the Bolsheviks revealed that, right, you had the Balfour Declaration, which was the British government declared the Mandate of Palestine, and Britain seized Palestine for itself. Britain had Palestine, and they began setting up Jewish settlements in Palestine. The reason that they were setting up settlements was because there was something in that region called oil. Oil. And especially in the 1930s, there was something called oil. And in Britain, you have a lot of bankers and oil companies that wanted to get some of that Middle Eastern oil. And they started, you had Theodore Herzl had been building the World Zionist movement. And Theodore Herzl had been constantly going to the British imperialists and saying, send us to be settlers. Right? That was basically the message of the World Zionist organization, is send us to be settlers so we can build a Jewish homeland. Send us to be settlers. So after the Balfour Declaration, after the British Mandate of Palestine was set up, the Jewish settlers went to Palestine. And what they did is they worked on behalf of, British corporations and British oil companies to defeat the resistance of the Arabs. Right? There were Arabs in Palestine who did not like the British Empire ruling over them. And the Jewish settlers worked with the British to beat back resistance to the British. Right? That went on. Then as World War II began, right, the pro-British Jewish settlers formed Haganah, which was the armed wing. But there was a faction among the Jewish settlers in Palestine that were anti-British and were not on the side of the British during World War II, but were instead on the side of Hitler. No one ever talks about this, but there was a group called Irgun, the revisionist party. Right? There was the Labour Party, the Israeli Labour Party. It's kind of a socialist-y Zionist group. They were pro-British. But there was the revisionist party. It was called the revisionist party. They were revisionist Zionists. That's what they were called. And they thought that it would be better for Zionism and for the eventual creation of Israel if the Nazis won World War II. So Irgun was the armed wing of the revisionist party. And the revisionist party did not support the British and was sympathetic to the other side during World War II. And in fact, there were a number of leaders of Irgun who made statements admiring a certain leader in Germany. And there were many leaders of the revisionist party who made statements to the effect of what he is doing for Germans and what this guy in Italy is doing for Italians, we intend to do for Jewish people. Right? And that there was a wing of the Zionist movement that was sympathetic to fascism. Again, this is all obscured by history. Nobody ever talks about this. But yes, the majority of Zionists were anti-fascist. Right? The Israeli Labour Party, Haganah, anti-fascist. But there was the revisionist party, Irgun, they were sympathetic to fascism. So that's worth pointing out. Next question. Socialism at a municipal level. Yeah, I mean, look, I think that having a socialist mayor elected in a city could be great. And that socialist mayor could enact very dramatic reforms that could really improve a lot of people's lives. Um, I think that especially in areas like rent control, for example, in areas like the priorities of the city budget. I mean, there's a lot of things that a socialist in power could do. Now, there is a thing that they joke about sewer socialism, right? Because it was a Victor Berger, I think, was a socialist back in like the 1900s, and he was elected mayor of Minneapolis, and he built a sewer system. And then revolutionaries said, "Oh boy, that's sewer socialism." But there are progressive things that one can do on a municipal level, no doubt. I mean, the fact that the priority of so many cities is the rich is a big problem. And I will add that I think that one great example of socialist reform on a local level, or a socialist movement taking power on a local level, would be the election of Coleman Young in Detroit. When Coleman Young got elected mayor of Detroit, that was very much a victory for the new communist movement and for the socialist movement. I mean, Coleman Young had been friendly to the Communist Party USA. He was elected on a platform of abolishing a division of the Detroit police force called STRESS, which stood for Stop the Robberies, Enforce Safe Society. And Coleman Young, when he got elected, that was kind of seen as a victory for socialists and communists, right? There'd been Drum and the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement. Unfortunately, though, the result was that the banks declared war on the city of Detroit, and they started pulling out the factories and all that because they didn't like the fact that there was a radical, and especially a black radical movement in Detroit that had so much influence, right? There were many communists in Detroit. Kenneth Cockrell, I mean, the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement, the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. Maoist communism had a lot of influence among the Detroit working class, among the black working class in Detroit in the 1970s. There were a lot of Maoist communists. And so because of that, the banks declared war on the city of Detroit. And that's a problem. I mean, Dennis Kucinich was mayor of Cleveland, and he was a great mayor, but the banks declared war on him. He refused to privatize the city's electricity, and the banks destroyed him. And banks have the ability to destroy cities, right? If the local mayor stands up to the banks too much, they can have the city devastated. And of course, then they blame the mayor. They don't blame the banks for doing it. All righty. All right. Private property in an urban setting. Well, look, I think that one thing that needs to be done in New York City, I mean, especially now, is they need to start taxing empty housing units. If you own an apartment building and nobody lives in it, you should have to pay a tax. Because right now, the price of rent is inflated in New York City due to real estate speculation. Right? The price of real estate is like the new stock market. It's a gambling casino, right? You buy a building, you wait for the market to go up, you sell it. Nobody has to live in your apartment building in New York City in order for you to make a profit from it. And in fact, if people live in it and they don't pay very high rent, that makes the value go down. So all across this city, there are apartment buildings that people don't live in. And the landlord still makes profit from it. That's a disaster. And that's a disaster that only capitalism could create. But real estate speculation is a big business, right? You have a landlord, and he buys a building, he waits for the market to go up, he sells the building. Now, because of the pandemic, rent is dropping, and the pandemic is a new situation. But for years in this city, you've had the issue of real estate speculation. And the reason rent has gone up and up and up is because in order for landlords to make profits, nobody has to actually live in the building. And that is a big problem. If nobody lives in the building and they still make a profit, you got a huge problem because, the rent can just keep going up and up and up and up and keep going up and up and up and up. And, they don't care, right? I would immediately impose a tax. I would have an inspector go around. And if somebody is not living and paying rent in this apartment unit, the landlord has to pay a tax and make every landlord desperate to fill up their buildings, and the rent would go down really quick. The rent would go down really, really quickly. If landlords were obligated, held financially accountable for empty housing units, the rent would drop really quick, right? And that should be the thing. Housing should be for people to live in, not for bankers and landlords to make money off of, right? Not for speculation. This is something the Chinese Communist Party has actually declared. President Xi Jinping has said, housing is for living in, not for speculation. And they have done a lot to fight real estate speculation in China, to control it, to make sure that people can afford the rents. The Chinese Communist Party is very good on this. I've written articles about this. You should read my work on this. But yes, like that's one reform you could enact at a local level, would be to force apartment building owners to fill up their apartment buildings. Because I can guarantee you, in New York City, there's plenty of people who want to live in that apartment. And if you can't fill up that apartment in New York City, it's because the rent is too darn high. Alrighty. Since we're talking about New York City, and the next question is, what about Trotsky coming from New York? Trotsky lived in New York at the time of the Russian Revolution. So did Bukharin. There was actually an event in Brooklyn. I think the Brooklyn Socialist Party had a forum where Bukharin gave the Bolshevik perspective, and Trotsky gave his perspective. Trotsky lived in New York City, but no, he wasn't a Broadway actor. I've read that before. People have said Trotsky was just this Broadway actor that the bankers paid. That's not true. Okay, that is absolutely not true. Trotsky lived in New York City, and he had a newspaper. I mean, it wasn't a secret that Trotsky... They always make it sound like it's this big secret that Trotsky lived in New York City. Did you know Trotsky lived in New York City? It's not a secret at all. Trotsky had a newspaper called Novy Mir, New World or New Peace. And it was a Russian language newspaper because there were a lot of Russians who lived in New York City. Right? There were a lot of Russians who ran away from the Tsar and lived in New York City. Trotsky lived on the Lower East Side. He had an apartment building on the Lower East Side, and he had an apartment, and he had a reputation. He was hated in all the cafes because he wouldn't tip. Trotsky would not tip in the cafes, right? Because every time they would bring him his coffee or whatever, and then bring him his bill, and they would bring him his bill, and he wouldn't tip. And he would say, I'm not going to tip because you should form a union and you should not be dependent on guys like me tipping. Aren't you humiliated by this tip? And he wouldn't tip. He wouldn't tip. Trotsky lived on the Lower East Side of New York City, and, he hung out with Russian speakers, didn't speak English very well. He spoke English kind of, and he wouldn't tip waiters in the restaurant. He was kind of like a Jehovah's Witness. Jehovah's Witnesses don't tip. You ever know that? If you've ever been a waiter, Jehovah's Witnesses refuse to tip. Instead, they just give you like their magazines, and they say, we're giving you God's word. It's like the greatest gift anyone could give. Not nice, right? We have an economy where, unfortunately, because of this system, waiters rely on tips, not class solidarity. Not class solidarity at all. Not tipping is not a nice thing to do. If you don't tip, you're an asshole. So tip. Don't be an asshole and tip. Now, in other countries, you don't have to tip, okay? And that's different, right? Other countries don't have that tradition. And it's a degrading tradition. I'll be real. It is degrading, for waiters and, to have to tip, right? Depend on tips, right? But, for Trotsky to do that, right, and say it was like this ultra-revolutionary thing that he was not tipping, asshole. Trotsky, the more you read about him, the more that word comes into your mind, But yes, he lived on the Lower East Side. He had an apartment. He wrote Novy Mir, the Russian language socialist newspaper, and he didn't tip people. And he was known to be a good speaker to Russian audiences, and I guess in English too. He could apparently speak enough English to entertain audiences. And he was just this well-known Russian guy. And he lived in London for a while. He lived in Vienna for a while. He was in exile, and his books sold, and he had a group of people sending him money, and he was, the thing you have to understand, this is the revolutionary intelligentsia, right? Sigmund Freud, Aleister Crowley, that even now, right? Not really anymore because of gentrification and stuff, but there used to be that in urban centers around the world, still, the hipsters kind of do it in a fake way. They're kind of like LARPing or pretending, right, that they're doing it. But starting around the time of the French Revolution, in urban centers, near universities, you generally have a current that you can call the revolutionary intelligentsia. And it's middle-class intellectuals and youth. They tend to be young and they tend to be middle class, but some of them are from the working class and manage to just join it, and some of them are not young and never grow out of it. But there's a current of people that just you know, and they're the revolutionary intelligentsia. And they're not just into Marxist politics. They tend to also be into, psychoanalysis, sexual, liberation and stuff like that. They tend to also be into the occult, right? The occults and mysticism. Trotsky hated all of that. The Marxists hated all of that, but it was big in the same circles. The occult and mysticism. It's just, it's this fringe of U.S. society, this middle class fringe, right? That's what you can call it. And historically, communist revolutionaries emerged from the revolutionary intelligentsia, right? New York City was Greenwich Village, right? If you watch the movie Reds, a lot of that movie takes place in Greenwich Village, and it's this Greenwich Village milieu, right, of people that live in Greenwich Village, New York. Well, that current, the revolutionary intelligentsia, right, that's where a lot of people became communists. And that's where communism started. Marx was from that group of people. Marx was one of those guys. And you have them in any society. You're going to have those people. The thing is, those people don't make a revolution by themselves, right? Maybe the revolutionary leader starts out there, but revolutions are made by the broad masses of people. That's who make a revolution, not the people hanging out in cafes in Greenwich Village talking revolution all day, or talking about Freud, or talking about, Aleister Crowley, or whatever the hell they're talking about, right? Revolutions are made by the broad masses of people. And as the point that I have made in my writing, in my book, City Builders and Vandals in Our Age, in my book on Kamala Harris, I even make this point, is that what we saw over the course of the Cold War was that basically Western capitalism hijacked the revolutionary intelligentsia and turned the revolutionary intelligentsia against existing socialism. Meanwhile, existing socialism broke with some of the destructive impulses of the revolutionary intelligentsia and actually became somewhat conservative. And that, yes, the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, right? Che Guevara, all of that stuff started with the revolutionary intelligentsia. What happened over the course of the Cold War was that as communism left the revolutionary intelligentsia and got to the broad masses, it became more conservative. And as the Cold War developed, the CIA and the Congress for Cultural Freedom program, and they started to figure out how to manipulate the revolutionary intelligentsia to make sure they don't become communists, right? This is what you need to understand, is that on the one hand, as communists get out of the revolutionary intelligentsia, they change their character. They become more populist. They become more, they just change, right? The goal is order, not chaos, etc., right? Stalin was very different than Trotsky. Stalin did not come out of the revolutionary intelligentsia. Stalin was from a rural village, and Stalin went to seminary school. Stalin did not come out of the revolutionary intelligentsia. That's why he was the one who ended up leading Russia, because the Russian people did not want permanent revolution and chaos. They wanted stability and socialism in one country, and that's what Stalin offered, right? Mao did come out of the revolutionary intelligentsia. He was the leader of an anarchist group called the New People's Study Society, New People's Study Group. He was a follower of Kropotkin, but, he joined the Communist Party, and eventually he started organizing the countryside. And he realized that it would be the peasantry that would make the revolution. And he changed the Chinese Communist Party so that it would be a party of the peasantry. That the revolutionary intelligentsia is a good place where ideas start, but it is the broad masses of people that make a revolution. The CIA has discovered through grants and funding and all kinds of stuff how to manipulate the revolutionary intelligentsia. That's a big point. I make this point in my book, City Builders and Vandals in Our Age. I think that Trotsky represented the most negative aspects of the revolutionary intelligentsia. I do, and that's why I'm the most critical of Trotsky, because that there is an element of the revolutionary intelligentsia that is purely destructive. That at the end of the day, they don't really want to change society. They're looking for some kind of cathartic revenge and destruction, and that is dangerous. And that while Marxists and scientific socialists, including Trotsky, right? Trotsky was very critical of the occult. He did not believe in the occult. While they reject occultism, among the revolutionary intelligentsia, the occult and occult-style thinking is very popular. And this book, The Aquarian Conspiracy, I mean, that is how Silicon Valley thinks. That's the orientation of the Silicon Valley fascists, right? And Malthusianism and primitivism and New Age thinking. That stuff is vile and reactionary and destructive. And that stuff, that's more in line with how the revolutionary intelligentsia thinks. They have a destructive impulse. They want to tear things down. They fetishize chaos. They fetishize violence and destruction. Whereas the broad masses of people, they want socialism because socialism will improve their lives. It will bring stability, bring greater abundance. So this is kind of the points that I'm trying to make in my lives. I hope you enjoyed the presentation tonight. I'm getting tired, so I'm going to cut it off here, but I do appreciate it. I appreciate the ability to come and talk to you here. So, remember, we need a government of action to fight for working families. We need a government of action to fight for working families. We need a government of action to fight for working families. A new upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression, but the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. While the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. While the danger of a new world war still exists, the people of all countries must get prepared. Revolution is the main trend in the world today. And on that note, folks, good night.